Welcome to this event discussing Roadkill, which is the new book written by Arthur Kay and myself. I'm Henrietta L, and I'm the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity at University College London. Arthur and I have been really looking forward to this event. Thank you all very much for being here and for coming to listen to us. I hope you'll enjoy the discussion that we're going to have. Now, Arthur and I have been doing a series of podcasts together, so we've developed this sort of Punch and Judy way of interacting. So if things get out of hand, please just raise your hand and say you think things have got out of hand, and we'll try and calm down. But we usually manage to be relatively well behaved in these public settings. But we are going to just pass back and forwards between each other. And we hope that in the questions afterwards that you'll feel free to express your views. Now, I suppose one should always begin really with the whole issue of why did we write this book? It seems a strange thing perhaps for someone who's the director of the Institute for Global Prosperity to be writing a book about cars. And lots of people have expressed some astonishment, I would say, that I would actually be involved in such a thing. Well, of course, I blame that entirely on Arthur, as you can imagine. But beyond that, the issue really is that cars impact our shared life together in ways we hardly recognize. We are so embedded, or rather cars are so embedded in our own lives. They're part of our intimate lives, they're part of our working lives, they're part of our imaginative lives. And one of the things that's become very difficult over a period of time is that cars have come to symbolize for us everything we imagine that we could aspire for. And I think the best image for that really is the standard kind of movie shot that you would see of people sitting in a car and driving along. And somehow it's the freedom of the open road that we have bought into, and this idea that cars are giving us freedom. And one of the things we wanted to say in this book is, look, people's idea of freedom and what freedom means for them is very different all around the globe. But what's important is understanding, how cars might actually be constraining our freedoms now in the 21st century, rather than giving us the freedoms we imagine we have. So I'm going to turn now to Arthur and ask him to say a little bit about why he got involved in writing this book. So, Arthur.
Well, it's great to see so many of you here, and thank you very, very, very much for coming. I'm hoping that we can, as Henry says, make this as much a conversation as possible. So if there are pieces, as you say, that you want to jump in and challenge or clarify, please feel free to do so. It's a conversation between us, but also between everyone here as well. So my starting point from writing the book was really kind of I studied architecture here at the Bartlett in this very building. I had like PTSD walking through the front door after my undergraduate in architecture. I got close friends from that course. Camilla at the back, I sat next to on my first day, and we had many fights in the following years. Similarly, my dear friend Huma in the front. So it's really great to be back. But when studying architecture, it felt that a lot of the books that we were reading about it and the designs that we were working on were they'd go through a whole theory about whatever it happens to be, about kind of embodied carbon or loneliness or urban sprawl or whatever it happens to be. And somewhere in the kind of chapter 17, paragraph 3 would mention, and by the way, this is all because of the car, and then kind of carry on with the rest of the book, and then it kind of go back to the other bits and pieces. And it felt that a lot of people were skirting around a subject, I think for quite often quite good reasons, but skirting around a subject. But it's sometimes, as Sonia says, seems quite myopic or narrow or niche to be writing a book about the car. So we really wanted to try and frame it in a broader context. And the reason that we chose to write it, again, you'd think, what an unusual pairing, someone who's a philosopher and anthropologist to be writing about cars, someone who's my background's in entrepreneurship and studying architecture, to be writing about cars. Again, it seems quite niche and narrow and quite weird people to be writing it. Why not a transport engineer? This would be the obvious choice. And most books around cars are written by transport engineers. But part of the reason, and we open the book talking about these kind of deeper, richer philosophical issues, and also some of the challenges and pushbacks to this idea of freedom that we've seen in kind of recent protests. We talk about the Oxford protests, for example, in the book. And part of our thesis around why that's been so tough is that it feels like things are happening to people rather than happening with people. So there's been a lack of that kind of underlying philosophical work, that groundwork to then bring hearts and minds with people, rather than jumping straight to the technocratic solutions about saying, right, let's slow speed limits, or right, let's move to electric cars, or what it happens to be. So that's kind of the thesis for why we started the book in the first instance.
Yes, thank you very much. And also, I think that one of the things we discovered when writing the book is that cars are part of our everyday life, and they're extraordinarily contentious. As soon as you introduce a low traffic neighborhood, or you put a bump in the road, a sleeping policeman as they're called in the UK, or do any of that, people are out there on the streets protesting. We had a number of people writing to us, I did in particular, one gentleman who kept writing to me from Oxford, so I called him John Oxford, saying it was absolutely important that he should be able to drive anywhere at any time and park exactly where he liked outside where he was going. Right? And he felt very strongly about this and kept insisting that this was the case. Now, this is, I think, an interesting idea, because what it means is that it gives us an insight, not necessarily a surprising insight, but a little bit of insight into the fact that the car is actually at the core of several problems for us, and one of which is, why are we so stuck? Why are we not at the point we need to be at in the discussions we need to have at this time in the 21st century? What's holding us back? And so part of the book is actually thinking about what's impeding our ability to move forward here. You know, is it just a matter of social media, or is it a matter of misinformation? Is it the fact that people don't believe in scientists? And it turns out that in a recent study of whether people trust scientists in about 68 countries of the world, and the answer is they do trust scientists. They say they trust scientists. They say they trust the evidence. But what's very important is that a very small minority of people claiming that there is a problem with evidence and trust, especially when it's amplified by social media, can mean that in policy terms, a lot of people back away from that policy because they're not sure that the policy that's being put forward is the right one. So there is a crisis around conversation, around trust, around social solidarity. And I think that what this hinges on partly is a sense not just of what one's rights are, but an idea that the car somehow symbolizes the choice that we can make to have a life of aspiration. And so anytime you try to do anything about the car, you're cutting off people's choice, and you're cutting off the kind of aspiration. Well, one of the things we discovered when we were doing the work is that actually choice is something that existed before. So I think I'm going to ask Arthur to tell you a bit about the picture that you're going to see in front of you now. There she is.
So this is my kind of new pin-up in terms of a huge fan of this person. So this is somebody called Lady Priscilla Norman, who was a suffragette, and she was wearing this kind of heavy kind of late Victorian clothing, and it was really annoying to kind of get around London efficiently. And so she decided to buy an Autoped e-scooter. This photo was taken in 1917, and so when we kind of think about I was under the delusion that until Line Bike and Line came along, that e-scooters were this kind of modern invention. When I was younger, I rode a micro scooter, and these were kind of things that kind of came along much later. And you know, the very crude narrative I had was that everyone was kind of walking around cities, getting from A to B quite slowly, and then kind of occasionally, if they were rich, had a horse, but everything was kind of rubbish with horses because they were smelly and you had to feed them and they died and all those sorts of things. And then Henry Ford came along and presumed the future was here and everything became incredible, and innovation started happening from there. And this is what we discovered through writing the book, a myth created by the car industrial complex to crowd out other options and keep us driving and keep us stuck to this single monomodal form of transport. And so when this photo was taken, the options of being able to get around the city were as many as today. You could drive your car, yes. You could also drive an electric car. We don't have it here, but there's an image of Manhattan in 1923, and the number of electric charging points was only actually surpassed in around the year 2000 in terms of the number of electric charging points that actually exist in Manhattan. It went right up and then it went right down with the rise in the internal combustion engine. You could cycle, you could also e-bike. The electric bike was patented in 1897. And so there was and also obviously you could get things like buses. You could ride your horse to work if you fancied it. And also the underground had already been built by this stage, or the first branches had been operating for around 50 years, I think, by this stage. So there was this huge range of options that happened. And what's happened, I mean, London is a slightly unusual example because there are a lot of options that we still have in London. But even here, still a large portion of journeys are taken by driving as well.
Yeah, so Bristol and Norman, exactly, a new pin-up for all of us, and mobility choice, because of course it turns out that the issues around transport are not just around transport, they're around several different things all at once, as I said earlier. And when we think about the car, we have to realise that we went from about 1886, when the first car was there, we went from one car in 1886 to about 25 billion in 1955. And we're now at about 1.6 billion cars in the world for 8.1 billion people. In America, there are more spaces for cars than there are houses for humans. So the car is a fairly major part of our lives, and it's taken over in an extraordinary way. In London, for example, I think about 14 square kilometres are dedicated to car parking, and that's about 10 times the size of Hyde Park. So these are huge areas of our cities that are taken up in this way. And one of the things it led us in the book to talk about was the fact that we are, in a sense, and because we were thinking about this issue of why are we not moving on this matter of the car more? Why is it difficult to move on it? And one of the things that we said in the book is that we are, in fact, car blind. So it's a bit like the fish in water argument. We can't tell that we're in the water. We can't tell that we've got this car problem because the car seems to be solving so many problems. And we're unaware of just how many it's creating. So I'm just going to ask Arthur to talk to you a little bit more about being car blind and to explain this image that we're now putting up in front of you after this one. Yep, this one coming here now, Arthur.
I mean, car blind is this idea that very simply we're very good at seeing the benefits of the car, and we can see our car, but it's as everything from when you walk along, when you walk along the street when you're getting home today, the amount of space that's given up to your car. So this is a Transport for London itself figure that roughly 80% of land, public space in London is taken over by car parking and car-related infrastructure. So that's this idea that, and in terms of that massively skews in terms of people obviously who own cars and then benefit from car ownership, and that's de facto subsidised cost. So there are the literal bits of car blindness, like this is the is it the water park in Florida, where the green spaces where the orcas hang out, and then the rest is all car parking. And I mean, it's an extraordinary image, and it's kind of ridiculous to the point. I mean, that's why we're showing it. But this is kind of how we're approaching a lot of our lives in terms of the amount of space that we unknowingly give up to it. And so why I mean, the subtitle of the book is Unveiling the True Cost of Our Toxic Relationship with Cars. We're basically saying that a lot of these things, because we are car blind, a lot of these things are hidden in plain sight, and all we need to actually do is literally open our eyes and walk home and think how dominant they are visually in our world, but also then we go and spend a lot of time talking about some of the direct economic costs. So car owners roughly underestimate the cost of car ownership by just over 50%. We talk a lot about so there's direct financial costs. It currently costs a driver in the UK around £9,500 per year to own and drive a car, and that's on average. So obviously that's more or less depending on different things. And we argue that the car, becoming a car owner and a driver, because people don't just drive for an afternoon, they usually buy a car and do that, is the biggest financial cost of your life. And and we're directly saying that's more expensive over time than buying a property. You can argue with me in terms of the details, but I'm going to refer you to this in terms of before going into all those details. But then there are a lot of hidden costs, and we don't have time to drill into them all today, but they're everything, and maybe Henrietta can talk a bit more around some of the costs in terms of things like air pollution, some of the costs in things in terms of decline in fertility, some of the costs in terms of the indirect impact on housing. So there's the direct cost of a parking space and that being subsidised, but then there's also a whole bunch of indirect costs in terms of how that land could otherwise be used, the opportunity cost of that as well. So we're really trying to kind of say, and I mean, we spend a lot of time on podcasts and various things like that, but we're proactively trying to talk to people who violently disagree, well, not too violently, but vehemently disagree with us. There is a guy in the book who we interviewed, Carlos Moreno, who has actually had to have full-time security for some time because he wrote a book called The 15-Minute City, which resulted in him getting so many death threats that he had to have the state provided 24/7 security for him, which is a sad reality. So not too violently, but vehemently disagree. So we've spoken to Texas Radio, we've been to Dubai to talk about the book. Potentially going to Riyadh. So we're trying to bring the book to places who are very car dependent, who kind of, it's almost a way of life and very tied to this idea of freedom and personal identity as well within that.
Yeah, great. And it is important to recognise that the car has had a very different life in different parts of the globe. I mean, there are many people across the globe who don't have a car. They can't really afford any form of mobility and certainly not a car. So you have to be careful about what we're talking about. But one of the things I would just urge you to remember is that if you go in a 70-year period from one car to 25 billion, which I gave you those figures earlier, and then suddenly up to 1.6 billion, then you're in a situation where car growth, were it to take over in the way that it has done in the global north, were it to take over in the global south in the same way, there would be an extortionately large number of cars on the planet. And if any of you who are familiar with, say, Nairobi, Lagos, Singapore, anywhere in the big cities of the world will know that they are already choked with cars. So if they were to have more cars in them, and if we were to have more cars, the actual tonnage on the road would be extraordinary. We would be literally stuck, like physically quite stuck. Now, one of the things, though, that Arthur mentioned is the cost to individuals of having a car, which is important, but the other part of it is the social cost. So until very recently, in most of the big cities in the world, when you had a regeneration project underway and you were building a new block of flats, you would have had to have given space. You'd have mandatorily required to give space for car parking. And what that effectively does is to raise the cost of every residential unit. Now, when you look at people's lives around the world and how they're struggling in so many contexts, when you ask people about it, as I often do in my other work, they say the two big costs are housing and transport. And when you put them together and when you realize how the one is inflating the other, you can see that it's not just that people's outlay on the car is enormous, but that its social cost to us in all societies is huge. It's driving things which we can't manage as they are and could only get worse under any scenario that you can imagine unless we choose to do something that's slightly different. And we're going to talk about what that is in a minute or two, and also maybe, I think, in questions take something around that. So Arthur asked me to say something about health, and here we've got impacts on various different kinds of things. So the health impacts of cars are quite extraordinary. I mean, the new research on this is something that itself is contentious, and it goes back to that problem about whether or not people believe the evidence that is put in front of them. But let's just say that air quality in London has been improving as a result of the ultra-low emission zone. It's definitely gone down. And that's a good thing. But the fact of the matter is that taken overall, air pollution probably costs the UK around £27 billion a year when you put together all the outcome costs of air pollution. Now, the figures for this can be contested, but any way you like to look at it, we could be using that £27 billion to improve our schools, or look after our elderly, or do any of the other things that we think we need to do in society. And that's what makes this issue around how we tackle the cars so difficult. And it's why in the book we say one of the things that is important is not you should know things, but what we're saying to people is there are things you can know. And that requirement for curiosity is enormously important in understanding how we begin to change things. So I'm going to ask Arthur now to talk a little bit about autonomous vehicles and the excitement around those, because there's been a big announcement recently about autonomous vehicles for London. So Arthur.
Yeah, so a lot of there are kind of three big red herrings or myths that we were trying to overturn when writing this book. The first was that the car is a technological miracle. A huge amount of time and money is put in advertising for car companies saying how incredible they are as machines and engineering. The second is that electric cars will solve any air pollution issues and any issues surrounding any environmental concerns that we may have around car ownership, and therefore just switch out your internal combustion engine car for electric car and everything will be awesome. And then the second is that if you do have an issue in terms of the cost of driving, or you do have an issue in terms of potentially dying in a car crash, or your child dying in a car crash, or you do have an issue with being stuck in traffic for ages, then everything will be solved by autonomous cars. And these are direct claims made by autonomous car companies. And there's a huge kind of economic opportunity tied to that as well. I mean, Elon Musk, who we quote in the book, talks about autonomy being for Tesla a $5 to $7 trillion opportunity. So he's saying, I'm going to make loads of more money if I can crack autonomy, and that's a big part of the business plan. If you talk to people at Google or Microsoft or Tesla and these big tech companies, that's a lot of what the future is based on for them. And as of Wednesday, I think 2 Wednesdays ago, Waymo, who's the autonomous car company owned by Alphabet, who also own Google, has announced that as of this time next year, they'll be operating in London. So this is a very live piece in terms of us as citizens of London, and also kind of just living in cities and all the rest of it, about what is the impact of autonomous cars going to be on our city. I guess probably not to be too much of a Debbie Downer on it, there is a world in which it does improve urban life. So there is a world, if it is properly managed and if the regulators, one of the hats I wear is as a board member for Transport for London, and we're going to be an important role in terms of how we manage and regulate autonomous cars. And so there are potential opportunities that come from it if we can move from a world of ownership to a world of access. So very crudely, what that means is a Lime bike or an Uber, you don't have to own the asset, you can use it for a moment. So this is kind of a big opportunity there. But the challenge is, or one of the risks is, around if it's unchecked and unmanaged, the cost of idling, and that's the cost of just driving around without a passenger in, will drop to almost zero. So at the moment, even with a very expensive driver sitting in a car, an Uber or a Lyft is empty, i.e. driving around the city, but without a driver for around 60% of the time. And so if you then remove the driver, which is the whole point of autonomy, is to remove the driver so you can remove cost and, in theory, deliver that benefit to the end user, you then kind of essentially mean that it's very, very, very inexpensive in order to just idle around the city the whole time. So how people manage things like that are going to be incredibly important, and how you can efficiently tax it. And the opportunity, I think, is if you can actually begin to tax mileage and extract some of the value and some of the costs from driving and doing so. The other piece is around how you can potentially, how cities will continue to sprawl. I think a lot of people in this room look to me like a very informed and educated crowd who are probably from an urban design or architecture or built environment background. So I won't kind of chat about some of the risks and downsides of massive urban sprawl, but when you, again, remove the driver, so you, in theory, could sit in the back of a car and go anywhere. I mean, for the book, we spoke to the director of mobility at Innovate UK, who's a very nice person, but whose kind of idea of what really great innovation looks like is that she wanted to be able to go to sleep in her car in London and wake up in Scotland to be able to explore and see her mother who lives there, and also to explore the Highlands. A very good vision if you think of it myopically as this one person, which is great. But if you then extrapolate that, so all of us doing this is going to really, I would argue, negatively transform the ways in which we live, and critically in ways in which our cities are designed, and start spreading out in all those additional costs. And so we don't actually talk about this in detail in the book, but we see kind of three big engines in terms of what's going to. Last year, we collectively, all of humanity, drove about 17 trillion miles, 17 trillion miles. So we're driving vast different distances. In theory, in the world that we introduce autonomous cars in the way that those companies are now talking about it, plus the additional induced demand from electric cars, which we might come back to, plus the piece that Henrietta has already touched on in terms of the emerging middle classes in the global south, we're going to see a world in which we will easily be driving 100 trillion miles each year by mid-century. So these are not, we're not driving, we're in London, so we probably think there's a world in which we're kind of edging away from car ownership, and a lot of us are moving around in different ways. But globally, we're going in a really, really worrying direction, and it's, I guess it's our job to think about those things and to see if we can introduce policies to be able to manage it in a way that doesn't extrapolate some of the issues we've had in the 20th century into the 21st.
Yes. So, now, I mean, one of the questions we're often asked is, so you've come up with all these problems, and so what's the answer? Right? Excuse me. So one of the answers is about increasing mobility choices. I mean, it is true that we could probably do with some autonomous vehicles on the street of a particular kind. So there's a very good, for example, self-driving buses scheme in Scotland that works very well. There are other self-driving schemes that could work well for rural areas of the UK or rural areas of the globe, indeed. And there are plenty of things that we could do to electrify our transport systems, which are actually all very good news. So we could make the most of technology. We could also learn quite a bit from the global south, where people haven't been able to turn just to the car, and have also had to understand that much of their mobility is actually provided by just-in-time, on-demand systems that have been there for a very long time. So any of you who've ever stuck out your hand to slow down a rickshaw, you know exactly how those things work, right? And so there's lots and lots of places, including, for example, Dhaka in Bangladesh, where actually electrifying the rickshaws has turned out to be a very good thing. So you don't have that horrible person pushing all the time on the pedals, which has always been a problem for rickshaws for me. But, nor do you have diesel-operated things. You actually have something that's better, gets people around more quickly. Those similar kinds of electrically driven rickshaws or thick rickshaw-like things are used in cities all over the world to move goods and also to move children. So to deal with all of these problems that people have talked about, how can I get my suitcase to the station if I can't go in the car? And the answer is, well, there are lots of solutions to this, and many of them coming, as I've said, from the global south. Right across a lot of African cities, which are cities I'm very familiar with, there's been a big move to move all motorbikes to electric, for example, and that's hugely popular. And in places like Jakarta, they've actually managed to solve the problem of how you have the battery swap stations. So you have the batteries charging somewhere, you just drive up if you're the driver, you take out your old battery and put in the new one. So lots and lots of things which are thought to be very problematic in the global north turn out to be quite easy to do in the global south, and lots of innovation coming from that space. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more. We've got several people in the room who know a little bit about these innovations. So Arthur, should we finish by saying a little bit about how it's really about working in a new way with communities and multiple stakeholders? Do you want to say something about that to start with?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is not, it's quite misleading with the title Roadkill. It's a bit aggressive, but what we're not saying is you're terrible if you drive or don't drive, or there are no cars ever. What we're really arguing for is saying that we firstly need to be aware of the scale of the problem and also where we're going. That it maybe sometimes feels like we're making progress, but actually the direction of travel is very, very fast in one direction. That is this 17 trillion to 100 trillion route. And so that's kind of, I guess, the North Star of the book, is to remind ourselves of that whilst there are lots of solutions out there, they're not being scaled as fast as the car industrial complex is scaling its kind of next attempt to keep us driving. The second piece is around kind of really focusing around the car in the city. We're not, if you live in a really challenging to access place, or you have constrained mobility for whatever reason, or you have other challenges that mean that you do need a car, we're not saying you're terrible if you drive. We're saying just think more carefully about it. So we have various decision trees and things like that in the book about saying when is a kind of way in which we can think about using the car in our life and having access to the car. So what we're really pushing for is how we can find different ways to live better together and to use the city as the focus of those discussions, and then the car is almost the vehicle to be able to kind of start those conversations. So that might be a spatial conversation about saying what do you want the curb outside your house to look like and what you want it to be full of. It could be full of your car, but it could also be full of a whole bunch of other stuff, which may be better for you. I mean, I've recently there was a lot of graffiti outside my house recently because they added a bike storage rack where there was a car parking space, for example. I mean, so it can be as simple as that in terms of a car. So it can be as small as that, but it also can be as big as thinking about. I mean, when you're talking about some of the either emerging markets or big cities in the global south. I mean, Taiwan has a population of 23 million, but 14, and it's a very pretty rich country, but has 14.5 million scooters. So the choice they've made is going from 2 wheels of walking and primarily biking to not adopt the car in the same way that American-style developments or cities have. It's also very warm, humid climate as well, and they've jumped to the e-scooter as a solution. So trying to give other pathways and choices to citizens and to cities to be able to decide which way they want it to go, rather than it having the car sold heavily to them as well.
And I think just the final point is that there is no single solution to this problem. These are solutions about context, because they're partly about what is a good life for people, and what is a good life for people varies enormously around the globe, as does the nature of cities and the history of certain places and the culture of certain places. But certainly what's important is that a lot of the innovation we see is about citizens getting together to reclaim the streets, to make sure that there are ways of biking or roller skating to school. All kinds of innovations that have basically come through lots and lots of local initiatives. And it is about people getting together at the local level and working with local authorities and working with local businesses and working with regional government and national government to produce the best outcome for them. And so there is here a real call for enhanced freedom, for the freedom that you are deciding where you live, how you want to live. And so there is in the book, I suppose, a call for renewed democracy of some kind in the 21st century, and also a recognition that that will be contentious, so it will not always be easy for everybody to agree, but that working together on a project that you can agree about does make a difference. And there's a very good example of that, which is really what happened in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, you might think the Netherlands have always been just full of people who are mad bikers, and that somehow something to do with canals meant that people always biked. I don't know what people often think, something strange about bikes and canals. Actually, of course, after the Second World War, the Netherlands were taken over by cars just as everywhere else was. And then there was a public pushback, and the public pushback came because so many children were killed on the roads. And globally, someone dies as a result of a car every 26 seconds. So this is an important issue. And that brought people together, because they didn't have to agree about what is the evidence on car tire waste, and they didn't have to agree on what's the evidence on particulates or anything like that. They just had to agree on the fact that it's not a good idea to kill children. And that was enough to get some movement and to bring some change. And so there are lots and lots of ways in which we can bring change. So I think we should stop, Arthur, and open up to the floor.
Yes.
Yeah, you can answer all the really hard questions. Okay. Yeah. So thank you very much. So let's just jump in wherever you feel able to. I think there are 2 roaming mics of the sort I'm holding close to my mouth at the moment. We have this problem about the fact they have to flash green before we can use them. Hang on.
Hi. I'm quite interested to know if you worked out how much energy, carbon production, and ultimately waste is used in transporting the bits of the car that are just stuff around, because this is not only a carbon problem, but a precious resource that's important for the whole of humanity for the rest of all time. But it seems that probably 80-90% of it is wasted moving a bit of steel that doesn't particularly want to be moved around. If you try to quantify.
No, you're exactly right. So we didn't do the research ourselves, but we quote Vaclav Smil, who's a professor at MIT, who's done some of the hard maths on this. If you're driving a average weight car around as a single driver, so a sole driver, it works out as roughly 95% of the energy generated by the car is moving the car itself rather than the person. So and that's the first myth that I talked about in terms of cars' technological miracle that we're trying to dispel. That we're sort of saying that cars are just brilliant inventions, and because they're brilliant, it was kind of survival of the fittest idea, that they won the Darwinian survival of the fittest and they therefore won. But actually they're not. I mean, I should say also electric cars are more efficient in terms of that, so that's an internal combustion engine figure, but it works out as roughly 95% of that energy is wasted in different forms.
Well, I bought an electric car because I thought that, and then I dragged 2.2 tons of car every time I went a mile, and it's just crazy.
Yeah.
There's the weight. You need something that's really like a golf buggy to take you that distance.
And there's this idea called car spreading, which is the idea that over time, if you look at ironically, even the Mini has literally doubled in size and weight over time. So there's a size issue, there's a weight issue, and then also what that does in terms of cities as well, in terms of crowding out other things. And a lot of that is because of consumer choice, more comfortable cars, more spacious cars, but also safer cars, but safer critically for the occupants of the car, not for everyone else around them. And obviously electric cars have the battery, which is incrementally heavier still. So there are cities who are doing some interesting stuff in terms of beginning to tax and regulate that differently, both in terms of things like congestion price, equivalence of congestion pricing with a weight and size ratio, and also car parking and charging heavier and bigger cars more. And London is kind of looking at various things of that as well.
Yeah, and then there's the added problem, of course, which Mr. Trump is currently exploiting, which is that the actual making of these cars involves moving large bits of car from one side of a national border to another side of the national border and then back again, and adding bits to it as you go. They are, in terms of their production, incredibly inefficient. But it does provide the opportunity for tariffs to be imposed. It's one good thing.
And at the front too as well.
Yeah. Hi, fascinating stuff. So behavioral psychologists have denoted, probably going back over decades, something called car brain, which I cannot remember whether you refer to, but it's obviously all to do with increased aggression behind a wheel of a car. And those bad behaviours, has there been any empirical research yet by the electric car manufacturers, or let's say sort of independent organisations, as to whether the prevalence of road rage and increased aggression, you're sitting in your hermetically sealed vehicle, somewhat supreme in your sense of independence from the rest of the world, has there been any evidence that road rage is somehow reined in electric vehicles? Because Oslo, for example, as you cite, has hugely rehabilitated its public streets over the decades, and all the taxi drivers drive electric vehicles. And the guy who drove me to the town hall gave me a guided tour of how wonderful his vehicle was. So he was the absolute ideal citizen, because he was the last person to be suffering from road rage. But this is really interesting, because Henrietta listed all the health costs, and obviously psychology is central to that.
Well, we did discuss some research which talks about how car driving isn't necessarily good for your mental health. Yes, I mean, there's not much good evidence on, how much road rage has increased over a period of time, except we all have a sense that road rage is increasing, but that's not the same thing as a properly researched piece of research. But there's also some evidence that those people who walk or cycle to work are happier than people who actually drive a car, and that's not surprising, because In London at the moment, for example, you're actually either stationary or stuck most of the time, and even when you're moving, you're doing around 8 miles an hour, which is the same as you would have been doing in a horse and carriage all those years ago. So you're not making much progress, really.
Yeah. Andy, there's, two bits I can add to that. So one is, rather worryingly, I was on a podcast the other day, and the other person there was an anger management specialist. And so not for me, but it's specifically about that point. So I'm definitely not an expert on that, but if anyone's interested, they can dig that out. But the point, there was a study some years ago looking at the heart rate level as a proxy for stress, at heart rate and cortisol levels of people who are stuck in drivers, in particular urban drivers, so spending a lot of time stopping, starting, and stuck in traffic, and they found that their heart rates were higher than active riot police officers, so people who are literally doing it, and also by fighter jet pilots. And that is probably both a testament to the calm nature of both those professions, but also to how angry. Well, I think anyone, I drive, Henrietta drives, but how angry anyone or frustrating it can sometimes feel being stuck in traffic.
Hi, just going back to the first image that you were talking about. Have you had any kind of research or study about Gen Z, Gen X not aspiring to have a car?
Yes, we have. And the data is very interesting on that. So it is true that overall, those who we might call Gen Z are more cautious about driving. They want to cycle more, they want to be more active, they want to be more carbon neutral, they don't want to be driving a car. But what happens is that when you start working with people and asking them how they feel about a car when they're, say, 18 or 20 or 22, can change quite radically once they end up with a first child at 28. And then there comes this thing about how do you move the child, and the granny and the luggage starts to take over. And this is where the argument has to be made for, a more diverse set of mobility options, so that you could be, if you needed to move granny and the luggage and all the kids and the violin and everything else that you need to take with you, you could go in the car, but you don't have to have a car all the time, and you don't necessarily need to own one. You need to have better public services and better choices around mobility. So it's really looking at how that would work. There's also some research which we looked at, which points out that young people are leading quite constrained and often very difficult lives financially. And that means that many of the jobs that they're offered require them to do things or be places or move at unreasonable times. So one of the people that we looked at was a young guy in France, living in rural France, and he just said, I don't want to drive, but I can't get to the job, without doing it. Yeah. So you can have that kind of problem.
And to add, I'm going to do a quiz question as well. So to add to that, two things. Firstly, with the point in terms of these moments of change where someone, let's say, has a child, or as an example, often what happens is then they build a lifestyle that's around that. So my younger sister Daisy is here. Our older sister has recently got 2 children and moved from living in inner London to moving in the outskirts of London. In doing so, she's moved from a 1-car household where they basically use the car, I don't know, once a week maybe, something like that, to a situation now that they now need 2 cars because of physically where they live and the built environment around them, and they need to use those 2 cars every single day, several times. And so it's those kind of situations where, and that's why it's not trying to blame people or anything like that, but it's saying you move into a situation where you become car dependent and you build in that lifestyle. And then from that, then it's very difficult to then go back to becoming, or not difficult, but often people don't come back to becoming a non-driver again. And my quiz quote is from Guess Who Said This? Today's young people see the car as an unnecessary expense, and in London, that's almost certainly true. It's the most unlikely person you can imagine. Who's the biggest? Jeremy Clarkson. That's the article he wrote in the Times last year. So it's interesting how even the most kind of car, I think of Jeremy Clarkson as just like a nutty car guy kind of thing, and so I wouldn't have thought us quoting him in this book, but even he agrees. So there you go. There's some questions at the back there as well. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Should we take a couple at a time?
Should we take two at a time?
Yeah.
Because we've got many who want to do it.
Thank you for outing me as your sister before my question. I am interested, haven't had a chance to read the book yet, so apologies if this is in there, but I'm interested in whether you've had a chance to look into, or to what extent you've looked into, future flight opportunities as a solution to some of this, and whether you actually think it is a solution to kind of congestion and other like car and road related issues.
Great question.
Hi. Roadkill framed the car as a symbol of false freedom. How might rethinking mobility help us to redefine what prosperity means in the modern city, also thinking of the smart city concept of the new modern city can be building and all the synergic productivity well for the community. Thank you.
So it's around flying cars specifically,
Well, yeah.
or options of them.
What about that?
Yeah, exactly. So we in short, we think it's a big red herring, the flying car. However, there are particular options. So it's not going to be a flying car. It's going to be versions of helicopters, which could be used in a similar way to helicopters as kind of high-end point-to-point travel. But the idea of a genuine mass urban mobility solution, it kind of has so many kind of complexities. Energy, air congestion, security, cybersecurity, noise. I mean, incredibly noisy. All these other bits and pieces, which mean it's not practically possible as a mass mobility system, but as a kind of a, let's say, cleaner, incrementally cheaper version of a helicopter for similar use cases like zipping to airports for really rich people. Then it will continue to proliferate, and there's a lot of investment going into it, in particular in China and the Gulf region.
Yeah, and also they could be very, very noisy, because direct takeoff is incredibly noisy. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why helicopters are so noisy. So of course many of these things could change with technologies that are brought in, but what we say in the book in general is that the idea that technology is always going to find solutions is a little bit of a red herring, because we need to find social solutions, exactly to do with the answer to the question I've just been asked here. Which really need to live in cities that are more livable, that are more prosperous, that allow people to lead a better quality of life. And one of the things that is often being said about the car is if you restrict the car's movement in the city, that you undermine the vitality of the city, because you're undermining small shops and you're undermining small business opportunities and small forms of employment and so on. And actually all the data that we've looked at is that in areas where the removal of cars has been carefully planned with local business and with local authorities and so on, you actually don't have that effect. This is a fear that people have. It was a fear that people had when congestion charging was brought into the UK, that something horrible would happen, say, to Marylebone High Street. Well, I can report that nothing horrible has happened to Marylebone High Street, except that Waitrose moved in. But apart from that, nothing horrible has happened to it in all these years. So, but you're right, what's required to get more livable, prosperous cities is not just about the car and mobility, although that's very key. It's a series of things moving at the same, series of things that have to be moved at the same time. So it is about infrastructure design, but it's also about more choice for people in terms of where the locations are for healthcare, for things like pharmacies, hospitals, also things like having grocery stores locally. So everything has to move simultaneously. And one of the difficulties is getting people to understand that this is a kind of whole system approach that has to be undertaken. You can't just move one bit. And when you do move one bit, you often get a lot of pushback, because moving one bit doesn't actually help everybody. And so people can easily then say, well, there's a low traffic neighbourhood, but now everybody drives down my street. And that's because that kind of planning hasn't worked out what really needs to be done.
Thank you. Is it working? Thank you. You've actually sort of led me into the question I have. So, because I work in sustainability and particularly transport, if we just stick to London as a city of example, the trade-offs that you have around all these different solutions. I'm just curious as to, Arthur, you mentioned you're on the board for Transport for London. What kind of solutions are really being discussed and coming into fruition to, for example, make cycling more accessible, and not like line bikes and e-bikes, but actually getting that as a solution that we can then convince people to uptake? Because one of the issues that I come across, or particularly maybe it's a personal thing, is behaviour change, and I think that's really at the crux, the key to this, to all these solutions. And so, yeah, I just wonder if you've thought about that. Maybe it's in the book. But...
Mm. I mean, do you want to go? Oh, should we take another one at the same time? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was wondering about the chart that you presented about the happiness and the mode of transport. It was quite alarming that bus is like a really sad way of moving, right? Because in terms of space, we have a lot of advantage in terms of carbon emission as well, in terms of the existing infrastructure, right? Because we already have a lot of roads. So I was wondering to understand why people are so sad when taking buses, because maybe it's a strategic way to.
Yeah. So, Elena, can we go back to that slide, the happiness slide? I think it's about three or four back. This one. No. Oh, that's it. Yeah. So they're actually slightly connected. So I'm just going to ask with a TFL hat on. So there's been a 10-year decline in bus ownership, and which has been despite trying lots of stuff, new routes and all the rest of it. So there's I don't think they even know what's going on necessarily, but there's a general issue in terms of the optics, the usability. Fares have been frozen, I think, for 7-8 years now. So it's interesting in terms of what's not moving the needle on bus ridership, when other modes of transport have seen quite big changes on that. It's been a relatively steady decline of that period. So I don't have a clear answer, but I think this graph is something to do with that kind of trend that we're seeing in London. There's some things that are happening around like connecting neighbourhoods, which is happening. So trying to these kind of super loops and that kind of stuff, which is Baker loops and things that are coming in to try and connect neighbours more effectively. They're going to take more buses out of inner London and move them to the suburbs where there's already a good tube network, but perhaps providing a better network in outer boroughs might be a route to do it. So there's various things happening, but it's a really good insight, and I don't think there's I certainly don't have a kind of clear answer to that piece. Which is almost the inverse, weirdly, of your question, which is one of the big changes is around this. Well, one of the big arguments in transport planning generally is around induced demand, kind of like essentially kind of build it and they will come. And the idea if you provide the safe, usable infrastructure that people will use it. And one of the big reasons that London is seeing such a big uptick in cycling, and we've now got more people commuting by bike than by car for the first time, I think, as of last year. Well, I mean, probably back in the day we did have more bikes, but in modern history. And a lot of that is building hundreds of kilometres of safe cycle lanes. So it's a very boring answer, but it's like kind of one around saying if you can provide that infrastructure. I spoke about the kind of new bike hangar outside my flat. So kind of building the infrastructure around it to encourage people to be able to cycle safely and efficiently and not have to compete for the road directly for the road with cars is a route that's beginning to see some very impressive results in London.
I think to answer your question very directly, it's partly about looking at where we have had change that's really worked. So, for example, there are certain streets in London and indeed certain tenement blocks where everybody has got together and decided that they're going to have a distributed solar energy system, and they're off-grid, right? So, they're not off-grid because they give energy back to the grid. But and certain kinds of technology which modulates usage, algorithmically and so on, has helped with that. But what is important there is that first of all, the opportunity has to be there. Second of all, the community has to agree with each other, right, or find some way of agreeing with each other. And third of all, they have to be supported in that decision through various kinds of things that could be complex. And you see very interesting ways in which that's been done elsewhere. So, for example, introducing solar power into Indian villages. One of the things that became very clear is that you needed to have the person who'd always been in charge of energy in charge of the solar panels, which meant that all the solar panel engineers had to be women, because they had been collecting the firewood, they had been doing all the energy input into the household. And so they managed the usage of the solar panels. And that in itself had a knock-on effect. Had a knock-on effect in terms of women having income, it had a knock-on effect in terms of girls going to school. It had a number of other benefits. And what doesn't happen very often in planning is thinking about where a change will have other benefits which will cascade from the first one. And actually communities themselves, when you work with them, are actually quite good at pointing out how that works. And that's because people's constraints in life are very often connected to the fact that they know that there are multiple bad things that happen. So, if you can't get to the hospital to see your mother, then X is going to be the consequence of this, right? She may end up in a home, etc., etc. So people have a lived experience of that and turn out to be much better, generally speaking, than either the Board of Transport for London or UCL academics in working out how this should be done. They need to be part of the process. On the bus, yes, now buses are, this is a very strange thing. I can't speak to the London data, but one of the things, of course, is that the bus has been relegated for a very long time to the idea of a second-class citizen. So it's second class to the bus. So some people don't want to be on the bus and they think it's inconvenient. Now, when we did this work with Milton Keynes, who tried to introduce a on-demand bus service system, which doesn't replace the main bus system. So the main bus system is still doing whatever it does with its fixed routes. The on-demand one fills in all the gaps. And this actually is turning out to work very, very well. I mean, the number of journeys that I think it now does is something extraordinary, like 500,000 or something a year. So it's doing a lot of the work. So it's really understanding how people want to move. And I think the old idea of a fixed bus route is what people find difficult, waiting for them, as it turns out, I'm a big fan of the bus in London. You can get anywhere in London on a bus. You just have to think about it. You don't need to, and walking, but you do have to walk to the bus stop. And for some people, that's not a problem. But it depends where you live, of course. So I think we'll just take two more, and then we're out of time, because I realise that people may want to interact with each other.
Hi. Thank you very much. Given the motor car is supported by the manufacturers and the fossil fuel industry, both hugely powerful groups that are formed by corporations whose only remit is to provide shareholders with profit. How do you tackle that? Because have you had any pushback from them at all in the book? From the book?
Great question.
Hello. Sorry to have to dispute the claim that London bus fares have been frozen for the past 7 or 8 years. I can confirm that in 2023 they rose from £1.55 to £1.65, and last year they rose from £1.65 to £1.75. I don't know, somebody regularly takes the bus. But my question actually was kind of more on policy. So a few weeks ago there was a Sunday Times FOI that uncovered that City Hall and Transport for London had suppressed a report into the effectiveness of low traffic neighbourhoods because it found actually that they weren't particularly effective. In particular that they increased congestion around those neighbourhoods, sort of reducing air quality and things like that, and also put cyclists at risk more because there would be more traffic in the surrounding areas. So I wonder, in terms of your perspective on policymakers and how they can change things, where do you feel as though perhaps we're being hindered? Is it sort of financial incentive that is pushing us back? Is it a disregard for perhaps greater environmental considerations? What is it that is not putting us in the right position and causing people like TfL and City Hall to suppress reports like this?
Well, both very good questions, and they're in a way connected. On low traffic neighbourhoods, it is absolutely correct. If you live near Earl Street roundabout, for example, so you know if you have a low traffic neighbourhood, but you've already done something else to a major arterial road next to it, without taking account of the fact that you were going to have a low traffic neighbourhood, the result is horrifying congestion, which is much worse for cyclists. I mean, I don't know how anybody cycles around Old Street roundabout or any of the other ones that have had this experience. And it is to do with the fact that there's not sufficient consultation in the local area and not sufficient understanding about how people are moving about. There is an idea that this must be good for people, and it's being essentially imposed from the top. And that is a big problem with policy, because this whole systems approach does have to be part of it. And if you don't get that right, you will actually create much more resistance to change than you need to. So you know, you can't have low traffic neighbourhoods and restrictions on car movements unless you're also providing safe biking and walking to school, which isn't happening at the same time. So it's maddening, this kind of situation, and it can be much better handled. On the question of how we defeat capitalism, this is a big one, of course. So far they haven't read the book, which is a good thing, because I really don't want to be outed on whatever X, yes, X, yeah. X it's now called, isn't it? X hasn't changed its name again, yeah. So, but I do think that there's no doubt that there are huge invested interests which are trying to prevent these transformations, but they are clever. So the coordinated climate movement was actually something that went on in the United States for a good 10 years, and almost all of the major fossil fuel companies were members of it and kept saying that they were having a new policy for the green transition, whilst at the same time lobbying Congress to make sure that nothing ever went through. And quite similar things, we also detail in the book, happened in the United Kingdom as well. So there is resistance because there are lots of people who are saying to themselves, actually, there's still a bit of that stuff in the ground. And if we can get it out now, we can still make money, right? So there's, and right now, you know, last week or the week before, Mr. Trump did that same thing again. So he actually pulled out on what was the agreement about greening shipping, with massive consequences for all of us, for carbon, across the entire world. So, you know, there's no doubt that people are filling their boots in what they think of as a moment of transition, which is actually exacerbating the situation. But equally, you know, green energy is on the up, and you know, things are going in the right direction, but it's not a easy move like that, as you know. It's a very, very choppy situation, and how you deal with that, I think, is by getting together with other people and making demands for things that you want to see, and outing those kinds of situations. I think that is, speaking truth to power is really pretty much all there is.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, and sorry for getting it so badly wrong. I'll have to do my research better. In terms of the kind of what we call it in the book, the car industrial complex. So this kind of, and we're not kind of framing this as an idea of like evil people kind of smoking cigars and coming up with schemes to keep us all, you know, stuck driving. But there was a whole bunch of, you know, interconnected interests which are out there to keep us driving. Like we talk about these as different industries. Like the, you know, oil we talk about as an industry, but you know, 69% of all oil ends up in a car, for example. So a lot of these things are de facto integrated into our system. So part of it, again, is this point around unveiling it and saying this is the reality of the situation, how they're interconnected. In terms of where the, you know, to your point around how one can go about tackling it, we talk about 10 battlegrounds in the book, or kind of areas that we think the main discussion points or areas are going to be taken over the next 10 years. The one I think is probably most kind of strategically important is around this kind of piece of autonomous and electric cars, and making sure that we don't kind of drink the Kool-Aid too much on that. But there are others ranging from, you know, existing suburbs and sprawling cities to the humble sidewalk. So it really kind of goes to a range of different things. We've now got time for drinks and various other bits and pieces. And if anyone would like to buy a book as well, they can do outside. And from me, a huge, huge thanks to all of you for coming and for being here.
continuity. Thank you very much.